Hello everyone! In this video, I am going to show you everything you need to know to start watercolor right now. I made everything super simplified so we can cut out all the extra and figure out what we actually need in paper, paint, brushes, and techniques. Let's start with paper. You'll need 140-pound watercolor paper so that your paper doesn't buckle, and my favorite is Arches, but you can use any kind of watercolor paper. There are two main kinds of watercolor paper, cold press, which has texture, and hot press, which is smooth. For most of my paintings, I prefer cold pressed because I like the texture, especially for landscapes or flowers. It allows the colors to blend and bleed nicely together. Hot pressed is really nice for lettering or for book illustrations because it leaves a really nice clean line with no texture. With watercolor, the less water you add, the darker a color is. So you can see at the top with the green, it is in a darker, more pigmented state. And then the more water I add, the lighter the color gets. So with watercolor, we don't add white to make things lighter, we add water. We'll go over the blending technique in the center a little while later, but I wanted to show you how different the writing looks on each of the papers. It's a little bit harder and choppy on the cold press paper, but nice and smooth and even on the hot press paper. I wanted to paint the exact same thing on each of these different cards. One is cold pressed and one is hot pressed so that you can see the difference and you can determine what you want to paint on for yourself. Now let's talk about paint. The two main forms watercolor paints come in are pans and tubes. This is a set of watercolor pans. They come dry and ready to use. You add a little bit of water to your color with your brush, and then you can paint straight away. Watercolor also comes in tubes, which is my favorite way to use them. You can get any kind of watercolor, pans or tubes in student grade or artist grade. There's a significant difference in color, vibrancy, and price. You can use the watercolor paint directly from the tubes, but I would suggest putting the paint into a palette and letting it dry overnight. Letting the watercolor dry before use allows you to have better control over your water to paint ratio. All you need to do is squeeze the paint into the wells on your palette and wait 24 hours before use. I also like this method because it allows me to control what colors I have in my palette and I can refill them whenever I'm running out. Once the paint is completely dry, you use them in the same way that you use pans, getting your brush wet, wetting the paint, and then applying directly to the paper. Now let's talk about brushes. When you're starting out with watercolor, really the only brush you need is a round brush. My favorite brushes are from Polina, but I know they can be a little pricey and she ships from Australia, so I would suggest this Cotman round size 6, and that's what I'm going to show you the other techniques with. In art, when we make a mark with our brush, it's called mark making, and every brush, depending on its size and shapes, makes different marks. Using light pressure and the tip of our brush, we can make small strokes, and with a lot of pressure and the body of our brush, we can make large strokes. And you can combine light pressure to heavy pressure and come back to light pressure again, and by mark making, we can see the different marks we can make can start to look like things like maybe a leaf. We can load our brush with a lot of water and a lot of pigment and make these big sweeping strokes, or we can do less water and less pigment and swipe it to the side to make these jagged, rough strokes that the paper really catches. Now we're going to do a simplified overview of watercolor techniques. The first technique is called wet on dry, and it's just what it sounds like. The watercolor is wet and the paper is totally dry. The next technique is called wet on wet, and that's where you're adding wet watercolor onto wet piece of paper. In this first example, I painted my paper with clean water and I'm adding pigment to it. You can see that with this technique, everything blends and bleeds and flows together. In the second example of wet on wet, I'm using paint first to make the paper wet, and then I'm going to drop in some more paint, and this will give it that nice blended and flowy effect that wet on wet gives us. This is a watercolor bleed where one color bleeds into the other color because they touch and they're both wet. This is a fun technique, but if you want to avoid it, just make sure your first color is dry. When you're painting with watercolor and you see that distinct line on the edge of the stroke, that's called a hard edge. Definitely necessary for some situations, but if you want to soften it up, you'll just clean your brush, add water to that edge, and feather it out along the paper. This is called a soft edge. In watercolor, it's important to maintain our lighter colors because we can't add them back. So we do that with different types of masking techniques. This is called masking fluid. So the masking fluid is applied to the paper in a liquid form and it dries into an almost type of rubbery consistency Once it's completely dry, you can paint over the top of it, and then once the paint is completely dry, you can peel the masking fluid off and reveal the white surface underneath. You can also use masking fluid on top of watercolor to maintain lighter hues while you paint dark colors around it. You can use masking tape to tape off your painting or create lines in paintings. You can use sponges like this to create textures, perfect for trees in any of your paintings. And one of my favorite ways to create texture is by using salt. So when your paint is wet, you're just going to put any kind of salt right over the top of it. And as it dries, the salt takes in the pigment and creates the coolest, prettiest textures. And that is my super simplified guide to everything you need to know to start watercolor right now. I know we didn't cover everything, but I wanted to cover just enough that people who are starting out know exactly what they need to know to start, and then we can talk about more and build upon that knowledge as we continue on. Sometimes there is just so much information and so much possibility that you really just need to get down to the bare bones and understand what you really need to know to just pick up the brush and start painting today. So right now I am just using a mixture of the different techniques we talked about in this video to play around with paint on the paper. But let me know in the comments below, is there a technique or a certain type of material that we did not cover in this video that you love to use? I would love to know what you think and to review it in another video of mine. Also, right here at the end, I added splatter. Don't forget splatter. You can splatter everything. Splatter all the paintings. I hope if you're a beginner, you found this useful, and if you are not new to watercolor, that you also found this a good refresher. Check out my channel for more tips and techniques, and I will see you all next time. Bye.